Hello, I'm Irene Natividad. I'm president of the Global Summit of Women, which will be holding its 30th anniversary summit in Bangkok, Thailand from October 8 to 10. Until that time, I want to bring the summit to you. And today, we're going to have a half-hour session on women on boards. How do you get on it? What do they do? And what advice would our renowned panel give to those of you who may be interested in making this a part of your career? Uh, why do we choose this topic? Because it is an arena of power where there's still not many women all over the world. In the 23 years that we have been doing research on women on corporate boards, we have found that the most number of women came from countries that took proactive steps to increase those numbers. Specifically, the quota strategy, which was started by Norway and has now been adopted by 28 other countries. Basically, this is a law that demands that a certain percentage of board seats must be allocated for women. The ones who've done the best, France and Italy, 40% was the target for France, and the blue chip companies went over that already. In fact, many of them have surpassed the target. The same with Italy, which had a target, a quota of 33.33%. But there are many people who don't like the word quotas. And so another strategy has been developed by the private sector, not government. And that is to include gender diversity into the corporate governance code. And there are now 32 countries that have taken this step. So sometimes those codes are in stock exchanges, in separate commissions, or in the Chamber of Commerce, as in this, as in Finland, for instance. So what does that mean? It means that gender diversity then becomes another marker for good corporate governance. And while the percentage of board increase for countries that have this strategy is not as much as those in countries with quotas, it still accelerates and speeds up in a way that it doesn't in other countries that doesn't have that gender diversity in their corporate governance code. The third strategy that the US has launched is one that is based on shareholders' votes. And basically what that means is that several investment funds, including, for instance, large ones like California Pension Fund, New York, New Jersey, etc., banded together, wrote to companies with their cumulative votes and said, you need to have a woman on your board. And as a result of that, over 300 companies now have women directors that weren't there before. So bottom line, you need targets, you need a proactive strategy, whether it is by government or the private sector or bottom up from shareholders. Doing nothing doesn't change women's access to these important appointments. So today, I've invited a very stellar group of very seasoned women directors, and I'd like to introduce them to you. Let me begin with Valerie Amos. She is Master of University College at Oxford University. Terrific honor to begin with. She was former Secretary of State for International Development for the UK. She was also the head of the Equal Opportunity Commission, and now she chairs a Fiat Trust. She is a board member of the Sierra Leone Titanium Resource Group. I met Valerie for the first time in 1998 when the summit was hosted by the UK in London. So that probably tells you I don't lose very good people. So next we turn to Carrie Dominguez, whom I've also known for a very long time. She was the former chair of the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Before that, she was Assistant Secretary of Labor. Before that, she has a very long career in executive search, well known for that. And before that, she had a banking career. Now she is on the board of Manpower, which is a global placement company, Trippl-S, which is actually Blue Cross Blue Shield. It's a healthcare company, and on the board of Calvert Fund, which is an investment company. Welcome, Cari. Next, we have from Switzerland, Diane de San Victor, whom I first met at the Global Summit of Women last year in Basel, Switzerland, where she served in the very successful host committee. Diane was the former general counsel and a member of the executive committee of ABB, which is a very large multinational technology company. And now she is on the board of Transocean, which is the largest offshore drilling company, Natixis, which is a financial management company, and also on the board of ABB India. Last, we have, but not least, Anne Sherry, whom I also met at the UK Global Summit of Women in 1998. She comes to us from Australia. When I first met her, she was CEO of the Bank of Melbourne, then she became CEO of the Bank of New Zealand, then she became CEO of Carnival Australia, then executive chair. But before all that, she was advisor to the Prime Minister on women's issues. So do you guys see a pattern here? Now she is on the board of Enero, which is a marketing and communications company. She is on a big board of a bank, National Australia Bank, on the board of Sydney Airport. And at one point, she was also on the board of rugby, right? The National Rugby Group Association. I don't know what they call it there, which she loved doing. So welcome to each and every one of you. So very quickly, I'd like very much to ask each of you, what was your first board? What was your position at the time when you were appointed to that board seat? And how did you get there? So shall we begin with Valerie?
Irene, thank you. Actually, my first board was the Sierra Leone Titanium Resources Group. I had just left government, and someone I'd worked with when I was responsible for Africa as a Foreign Office minister contacted me and asked me if I would be prepared to go on the board, which I was very happy to do because it was part of trying to reorient the company to be more responsible in terms of its community engagement and what it was doing in Sierra Leone.
Terrific. Cari?
Thank you, Irene. Well, my first board came through a search firm, an executive search firm. I had just left my presidential appointment as chair of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And as you mentioned in your introduction, the board was Manpower, which is a global company staffing, very appropriate to my background. They were looking for someone with a public policy background as well as a human resources background. So I fit that particular component in their skill sets matrix. I do have to tell you that you mentioned Department of Labor. I had the privilege of launching the Glass Ceiling Initiative at the Department of Labor, which was very gender-driven and very driven for people of color. So when the word manpower came to my attention, I thought it was a reputational risk to join a company named Manpower. But those concerns were allayed. A very, very progressive, fantastic company.
Great. Diane?
Yes, thank you, Irene. So my first board was at Barclays PLC. And as you explained in your short intro, at the time, I was an executive committee member, general counsel and company secretary at ABB. Because I changed jobs every 5 years or so, I had prior experience in various industries and experience in financial services as a corporate client. Now, this opportunity came to me via a search firm. I was referred to the firm by a colleague, a male colleague, by the way, and I received lots of great support from colleagues and prior colleagues as part of the board recruitment process for this first position. So the people in my network made it happen for me.
Great. And Anne.
Hi, Irene. My first board was a financial services board, and it came to me after I'd finished my banking executive life and had moved into Carnival. And it was someone that I had worked with previously in banking who was the chair of that board, who approached me to join. And I was very happy to keep my hand into financial services, given that I'd moved on to another industry. So it came really via a former colleague and was a direct approach.
Well, as everyone who's heard all four of our incredible directors can see, there are many routes to board appointments. So now I want to turn to Valerie Amos and Carrie. You two have now served for many years on many boards, both profit-making companies as well as nonprofits. Why do you think institutions, companies in particular, should have more women on boards? What is the argument for it? Valerie, you want to take this first?
Thanks, Harry. Well, I think that there is something really important about diversity of thought. It is not just about gender and ethnicity. I think that's important too. But there is something really important about getting different ways of thinking and kinds of thinking so that there is challenge within the boardroom. And all the evidence, all the research shows that leads to a much more productive company in terms of profitability. I sit on a lot of not-for-profit boards. I sit on a lot of foundation boards, and we have found that having that diversity of thought helps us in terms of our strategic thinking, the kind of environmental analysis that we do, and how we think about where we want to be going forward. So I think it's very, very important to have that diversity.
Anne, your thoughts?
I agree with that. I think the other thing I'd add is on the boards that I've joined, and often I've been the first woman to join the boards, whether it's sport or commercial boards, everybody speaks in a code that they all understand. And my arrival on those boards in some ways has been to challenge the status quo code that they speak and understand, which means they've stopped asking the hard questions often. So I think it's a combination of not being in the club is an advantage when you first come onto boards. The challenge is not to be part of the club once you get there, because I think that diversity of thought, questioning, bringing fresh perspective to board conversations happens when you get someone with a different perspective, and whether that's, joining boards that seem not to have any consumers on them when their business is about consumers. There's a whole lot of men who've never done any shopping. That's always seemed like a strange thing to me, or whether it's a financial services board where the experience of women dealing with them is so different. So I think all of those issues coalesce when you bring someone with different experience, a different way of thinking onto a board. And, women have been outsiders, so we bring an outsider's perspective.
Well, it actually, oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, Irene. I was just going to add to Anne's point, because very often what you also find is that the kind of question you ask is something that others on the board have thought about asking, but don't ask because they think that the question is too straightforward. So that point that Anne made about code and the kind of code that exists in a board where people are like each other and they've asked the same questions all the time, they don't go back to the basics and sometimes ask the really challenging questions for the executives to grapple with.
Well, there have been so many studies, as both of you know. There are now 80 studies of the correlation between more women on boards and better financial performance of a company, whether it is reducing risk or return on equity or return on investment. But it seems that there's still many CEOs, there are still many executives who don't quite believe that business case. So we always tell everyone, you should repeat it, because board appointments of women and people of color should be on the basis of a business strategy, not necessarily fairness and justice or representational, but because it's good business to do so. Now, I want to turn to Diane San Victor, as well as Cari. Why should women even plan to be on a board? What's in it for them? Why should they make it even part of their career? It's not easy to do, not easy to get there. So why? Cari?
Yes, well, let me first say that board service is not for everyone, as my fellow panel members can attest. The demands, the time demands, and the issues have grown exponentially for quite some time now. But having said that, I think if women have the interest, the commitment, and the capacity to join a board, they would add immeasurable value because of the platform, the opportunity to engage in strategy, the opportunity to bring the S under ESG, the environmental social governance components, which have grown so much. We spend a lot of time on climate change, but we really haven't spent a lot of time on the social changes. So when you look at pay disparities, when you look at harassment, when you look at these types of issues, the tendency is to look at the women. They really should be looking at the men on the board, but to look at the women on the board and say, what added value can you provide? And so I think from the perspective of a personal development, personal growth, is an excellent platform for women in the C-suite to really get to the highest level, the inner sanctum, as you will. I think Anne mentioned they speak in a different language. They do. But it's important to understand that language and to learn to speak that language and to be disruptive when that language is not inclusive. So for women, it's a wonderful opportunity. It's a great developmental opportunity, but you have to be careful, and you have to choose wisely as to which boards to join.
Diane?
Yes, thank you. And building on your comments, Cari, I'd say consider boards if it's right for you. And it's right for you if you feel like now is the time you want to contribute your experience, your personality in a different manner in the business environment. If you have time for it, and it's been already said, and do not underestimate the time it takes to serve on a board, because either you can combine with a very demanding executive job, or you're done with your executive job, okay, one way or the other. But the time question is quite important. So go for boards if you are prepared to leave operations to management and concentrate on strategy, if you prepared for being disrupted by unforeseen events, because these unforeseen events will happen in this boardroom. I can tell you it will happen to you. So you also ready for boards if you want to collaborate, inspire, and influence, even though not getting things done from your end. So just to sum it up, go for it if it's important to you, and not primarily because you're a woman, but because you're a solid business leader with a good head, strong values, and want to have impact in business and society.
Well taken. I have to tell you that during my board service, I did learn an enormous amount. So back to Cari's point about it being also sort of like another MBA, if you will. I want to come back to you, Cari. you have spent, Carrie Dominguez, you have spent many years in executive search and board search. So what are the qualities, what are the basic qualifications that are necessary for women to think about if they want to be a board nominee? And going forward, what are the skill sets that boards are wanting now?
Well, we continue to see a strong preference on the part of boards for active or retired CEOs or CFOs. Those have been the traditional sort of background that a board will first look for. But I am so pleased to say that the future has bodes well for women and has been improving, because the trend now is to look at functional excellence in a particular professions, technology, human resources, marketing. Companies have gotten much more scientific, if you will, looking at specific skill sets. What do we do? Do we need somebody with global experience? What do we have on the board? They're doing gap analysis to see what we have versus what we need. So I think it's important for women specifically to identify them and what sets them apart. And that's the big challenge. When I was doing search work, a CEO would say to me, Carrie, I want you to find me somebody that is highly admired, that people will respect, that has had a platform, not just in the marketing profession, for example, but throughout, maybe a speaker in trade associations or whatever. They're always looking for people who have written articles, who have positioned themselves as thought leaders. I used to say they're looking for people who are water walkers who can also swim, because they really want that top person. So the challenge for women is, well, how do I set myself apart in this large group of peers that I have? And again, going not just within your network, but getting known outside of your immediate network is critical. So it's really a very positive thing that's happening when you look at functional specialization to pursue, because we don't have that many retired women CEOs or even active women CEOs. So they've got to broaden that pool, and that professional specialization will help tremendously.
I think that's a good development, Carrie, because in the past it was more title as opposed to skill sets. So
Right.
Now it's great to have skill sets as a focus. So let me turn to the rest of you, to Valerie, Ann, and Diane. Now that Carrie has articulated, what are some basic skills that potential board nominees should think about? What are the steps to getting into a board? What advice could you give to our audience that's thinking about, well, I'd like to be on a board, but how do you go about it? So who would like to begin? Valerie?
Well, I think that it's really important to know what you're interested in and why you want to be on a board. Talk to other women or just other people that you know who are on boards to get a sense of what it's about, but also to demonstrate your interest. I think it's important to, if there are skills that you think you can bring, think about how you give greater visibility to and added value to what you could bring to that board. Are there speeches that you can do? Are there events that you can attend so that you can raise your visibility? Really use your network. Talk to people, get a sense of what is out there and where you can contribute. And don't just jump at the first opportunity. Very often people get concerned that it will never happen and they jump into an opportunity that is not necessarily right for them. It's both a learning experience, it's about expanding your own knowledge and expertise, but it's also about bringing something to the table. And if you get it right, it's a really rewarding experience.
Diane?
Yes, thanks, Irene. Something you may want to do is to first work on yourself and somehow remove your own barriers. For this, there is a need to get a better understanding of what it takes to serve on a board. Somehow demystify a bit, the board role. What you can do, you may decide to volunteer for projects with, board touch points in your executive job. Find ways to see firsthand how it works in the boardroom of your employer company. Volunteer to prepare board presentations. Get yourself on the list of presenters in the boardroom or on the list of guests and participants. See if you can get invited at the talent party that will be hosted by the board at the upcoming board meeting. These kind of initiatives, they are very easy because I'm talking of somehow getting closer to the board of your employer company, because you're going to learn a lot from this. Now,
Diane, there are not many executives, and I know this from my own experience, who are invited to present to the board. And only recently, after the sexual harassment, Me Too movement, all that came about, were human resource officers invited to present to a board. So I just want that out there because it's not as open as it may seem.
Well, that's only confirmation that we have opportunities for improvement here, because the board will benefit a lot from a larger participation from management instead of being limited to just, the happy few. So if I'm in a boardroom, I'm going to ask for the opportunity to get to meet, many more talent in this company. So if I may, just as a suggestion. Now, in terms of what you should not do, of course, do not compromise performance in your executive career for an external board that may or may not happen. So to me, priority is your executive career, because at the end of the day, you're going to be recruited for a board role as a consequence of what you've achieved and the experience you have developed in your day job.
And how do you make yourself visible so that you get tapped on the shoulder for a board appointment?
There's a few ways of doing it, Irene. I think most countries have the equivalent of, for example, an Institute of Company Directors. And being part of that network is a way of getting visibility. It's also a way of meeting influential decision makers on boards, whether that be the current chair cohort or others who are talking about, chairing nominations committees and so on. So finding your way into those networks, joining those organisations. Some countries, and we have it in Australia, actually have a mentor sponsorship program where chairs of boards are asked to meet with women who are interested in being company directors and giving them very direct advice on what they would need to do to join a board, to help them think about it, and then to sponsor them through their own networks. And that's been a very successful way of increasing the number of women. But I agree with what everyone else has said as well. Use your executive career as your stepping stone, use the networking opportunities. Just to the point, though, of what sometimes what not to do, and I'll share one of my experiences. I was a member of a subsidiary board. So, Australia's a long way from many of the headquarters of global organisations, not all, but some. And I was on the board of ING here in Australia for quite some time, again, following my financial services history. And I was invited to join the ING Global Board based out of Amsterdam. And I did all my research, and it was a cracking opportunity, a big global company that was going to be meeting around the world. So I thought, well, that's okay, I can manage that. But after a couple of years, around the world tended to meet European cities close to Amsterdam. And for me personally, it meant that I was constantly on aeroplanes, constantly. We met once a month. It would take a week to get in and out of a single meeting. And in the end, even though it was an amazing appointment, it's an amazing company, it was very prestigious. it was killing me. And so there's also a piece about your own survival, I think, in this space. And if the time zone travel is incredibly difficult to manage, even though my heart and my desire to be on such a prestigious global organisation drove me to do it, in the end I had to step away because it was too taxing personally. And it meant that I was not as efficient as I could have been, not as engaged, because I was falling asleep in half the meetings. And so that dynamic, I think, is also, you've just got to be aware of your own limitations. And, you know, I thought I was unlimited, but I discovered I do have a limitation.
Well, that's a very good point to make. Thank you for using yourself as an example. It actually goes back to Valerie's early comment about, you know, don't choose, what's it, you said, pick the right board, Valerie. Yeah, and you thought you did, and then you see the physical cost. So now I have a question for all of you. Clearly, this is a different time. You've seen a lot of protests in Sydney in Australia, in London in the UK, all over the United States, in France, in Italy, Brazil, that have to do with inclusion of people who are not the majority. So what can board directors do during this time to create a far more inclusive corporate leadership, whether it's for women or people of color? How do you do that? And do you feel that that's a special task for women to bring in other women? Because I had a friend who said to me, you know, Irene, it's hard enough just to do my role as a director. I don't have to carry water for other women. What do you guys think about that? Anyone?
Well, why don't I start, since I have my Indigenous art as directly, symbolically behind me and deliberately. On one of the boards that I'm on, we've talked about the pathway to boards and how executive, being a CEO and so on, is one of the most obvious pathways to board work, which for most Indigenous women in my world is not an obvious pathway. There are very, very few Indigenous women running anything other than quite small businesses. And so on the bank board that I'm on, I co-chair with an Indigenous woman, an Indigenous advisory group. And we've done that deliberately to give women exposure to the corporate environment and to hear, and also not just women and men, Indigenous men and women, to give them exposure, but also for us to hear their voices, because it's so difficult to get your voice heard in what is already an incredibly noisy environment. So that's the first thing. Secondly, it's a way of learning how big corporations work, think, actually, you know, look for talent. And finally, it gives us a way of exposing people who are maybe not as visible because they're Indigenous to the company and to the executives of the business and the other board members. So it's not, it's not a fail-safe strategy, but it is a strategy to start to grow capability, grow talent. And I do think we need to carry water for other women. I think we have a responsibility to do that. And we also have a responsibility collectively to not leave anyone behind. It's not right to have whole sections of our community locked out. And for companies like big banks, they're a core part of our customer base. They're a core part of our operational base. We need to be finding ways of including deliberately, not assuming that they'll find their way in, because they're not easy places to break into. And that's, we're pushing into that also with a couple of the other boards I'm on now, because it's a very effective way.
Yeah, but you're different, Anne. You've had this, you've been carrying water for women for a long time, just like Valerie. Valerie, your thoughts?
So I 100% agree with Anne. We have a responsibility to carry water for other women. Otherwise, what are we doing there? My own board, this is of the university where I'm director. We have a system where we want to bring on younger people, for example, So they will shadow a board member for a year. They will participate in board meetings, but they don't have a vote. So that a year on, they understand the issues, they have a sense of what being a board member is all about, and in a year's time, they're able to join fully. I think that's really important. It's about building a pipeline, and I think you can do that not just with the younger people, you can do it with women, you can do it with people from ethnic minorities, you can do it for people with disabilities. It's about growing the confidence to know that you have a contribution to make and that you have the space in which to make that contribution. And I think that's incredibly important.
Well, but I don't know whether it was you who talked about intentionality on the part of the leadership of a company or an organization, that is something they want to do. Diane, what do you think? What are your thoughts?
Well, of course, I fully support, what the other panelists have said. Maybe somehow highlighting another dimension from a diversity standpoint. In the aftermath of the pandemic and also the social tension that you've just highlighted, let's make sure that we pay enough attention to our global resources. We need global talent in our boards and also on our executive and executive leadership teams. And as we speak, there is somehow a risk that we're going to become less global, which is a nonsense from a business standpoint because our businesses are global.
Cari?
Well, this may sound elementary, but the first thing I would do is to elevate the conversation around diversity to the full board level. Hard to believe that a lot of these discussions have been relegated to the human resources or the compensation committee and not really have had a full discussion about strategy on diversity, around metrics for diversity. On the board, we measure everything. I always say we treasure what we measure. And we measure the financials, we measure the market share, we measure the voice. Why not measure the diversity issues? It's a growing concern among the shareholders and all the other stakeholders, customers, employees, suppliers. So we do need to use our voice to come up with an actionable, compelling case. And you mentioned it earlier, Irene, you said the business case. Because we've always focused on is the law, it's the moral or the right thing to do. But in the shifting demographics, in the globalization, and all of the things that we've talked about, it really is a business imperative to look at diversity of views and to have those representations at all levels and in all areas of employment and at the full board level. And so there are two attributes that I consider critical. What I try to do, because whenever there's a diversity question, people look at me, usually on a board, and I've tried to find a champion, a male, a lead director or a strong, influential male voice that I can partner with, because it is expected of me, but oftentimes it comes much more effective if we can do those types of recruitments. And I have done it and it's worked.
I totally agree. I used that strategy one time when I was vice chair of compensation. I found me, aside from my chair, another ally. And sometimes you just keep quiet and you let them bring it up.
Exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you. Those are great points to make. And now we're ready for questions. So I think we have a question from New Jersey.
Yes. Hi, this is Paul Lishu with the editor-in-chief of Diversity Global magazine. Thank you so much for taking my question. We're living through a very historic moment globally. What efforts are being made to recruit qualified and successful women of color, primarily Hispanics, Blacks, and Indigenous women, onto boards who can then become role models for girls and young women in their communities?
Great question. Who'd like to take that?
I'll take a stab at it, Irene. Thank you for that question. unfortunately, women of color are the lowest ranked in terms of the representation on boards. What I would say is that the concept of diversity has had a tendency to mask underrepresentation and underutilization among certain groups. So I think, and I did mention the intentionality component. I do think we have to look at the race, at the gender, at the nationality, at the ethnicity, not under the broad umbrella of diversity, but intentionally at the specific subgroups that will then make up the diverse component. So I think boards would be well served to unbundle the concept of diversity and to really focus in those areas of underrepresentation and underutilization in their companies and in their boards.
Great. Valerie?
In the UK, we're way behind on this. And I think that recent events, and particularly the heightened awareness as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, means that I think there's a window of opportunity, I think, for boards to really think about this seriously. It's about accountability and it's about a wider social responsibility. So I absolutely agree that we should be talking about what's happening to Black people, what's happening to people of color, really tease it out, because when we put it all together and bracket it, as we do in the UK, as Black and minority ethnic people, what we do is that we hide the different variations and those groups that are so underrepresented that very often they don't even feature in the figures. And I absolutely agree that this is something that a board as a whole need to consider. These issues are part of the strategic intent of an organization and need to be considered by the whole board.
Anyone else? Well, I think this is a very special time, and I do think we have tailwind that will push boards at large, as Carrie said, as a whole, to look at diversity and inclusion issues in a way that they hadn't looked at before. Because if they don't, frankly, their names, their reputations are on the line. Because you can't fool people anymore. You can't have this percentage of women, this percentage of people of color, and only at the lower level. People are now demanding, what about up there? So, next question, I think we have from Mexico.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Patricia Gonzalez. I am really very happy to be here. I was a former global director on the board of PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you very much for taking my question. During this pandemic, what issues did your boards have to deal with that were not part of the normal agenda? Did the pandemic change the way your companies do business?
Wow, great question. Anyone? Hey, Anne.
Can I start? Let me start. So I'm on the board of Sydney Airport, where our passenger numbers went from millions to zero almost overnight. So I sit on a board where our revenue just disappeared instantly, and it's caused the board, we've been meeting weekly, to have to completely rethink how we operate over a potentially quite an extended period, because our largest proportion of our revenue comes from international flights, not domestic. And domestic's reopening, but international probably won't open until the end of the year. So our board cadence, the issues we're dealing with, the testing of our resilience, the testing of our capacity to forecast has been at the absolute extreme ends. And I guess I contrast that with a different set of issues that on the bank board, which is how do we manage customers who are whose businesses have had to close during the pandemic? How do we keep them going? How do we decide whether it's responsible to extend people's debt when we know they may not reopen? And so we're balancing a very delicate set of issues for individual business owners around lending to them responsibly and managing to keep them going if we think, you know, if there is an opportunity for them to reopen. So again, we've been meeting weekly, and we're now facing into, on the bank side, how do we get people back into work? How do we get them back into offices safely? What do we have to do to open up offices? How do we reorganize ourselves? The issues are issues we would never have imagined that we were going to face into. And I have to say, I have never worked harder in my life.
I can imagine.
Yeah,
It's not just you.
Weekly meetings, hours on these issues every single week at a board and executive level, as we really traverse completely new territory.
Thank you for that example. Anyone else?
I'd love to come in, Irene, if I may.
Okay, Valerie, is it?
So I'm on the advisory board of a hospitality company in Kuwait. They have a hotel, but they also have services that they provide, including water services, education. And we've had to do a tremendous amount, again, in terms of looking at the bottom line and what the implications are, because the hotel is now closed. At what point is it going to be able to reopen the hotel? How do you keep the staff on board when there's no income coming in? So restructuring the finance to enable us to do that. Looking forward, what is the world going to look like if you don't have flights coming in, if the appetite that people have for tourism goes down? So what's the future going to look like in terms of education and school provision? What do you do when schools reopen and you have social distancing? How do you move things online? I mean, a host of issues. And of course, the well-being of staff has to be at the top of the agenda. So a whole range of issues that we're having to look at.
Wow. Anyone else?
If I may just add to what's been already said, somehow combining the pandemic with the strategic agenda, because yes, of course, we have to discuss and review health and safety of employees, of course, liquidity, supply chain, etc. But at the same time, also concentrate on our strategy. First of all, because it cannot wait, and also because what's happening as we speak will have an enormous impact on the strategy of the company going forward. And finally, we've also learned a lot about our leadership because, of course, leaders have been tested as part of the pandemic.
Wonderful. I wanted people to get a sense of what board directors have to deal with, and you guys did that brilliantly. All of you have been terrific. So thank you so much. And thank you to our questioners. I'm sorry we don't have enough time for more, but this has been a wonderful roundtable. Thank you all. And I hope to see all of you who've been listening to this webinar, to this roundtable, to join us in Bangkok, October 8 to 10. Thank you all. We're now closing this session.